kidneys. I've got new kidneys. I don't like the color. How would he know what color his kidneys are? He just got them. I don't even know what color my kidneys are, and I've had them like my whole life. Hey, welcome to Class Act Media. I'm Jack, and today we're going to be talking about what I consider to be one of the most interesting and also underrated parts of the revived era of Doctor Who, the Peter Capaldi era. Let's get started. If you're a Doctor Who fan, stop me if you've heard this one before. Oh yeah, I used to watch that show all the time, but I kinda gave up once Peter Capaldi took over. I think this is for a number of reasons, not least of which was every season of the Matt Smith era seemed determined to outdo its predecessor in terms of how insane and convoluted the story could become, and most audiences had just become completely exhausted on the whole thing. It also probably didn't help that a large amount of the Tumblr girl fanbase the show had acquired jumped ship once the Doctor stopped being young and hot. But I mean, look at this man. You can't tell me this isn't a handsome man. But even then, I think Doctor Who could have still kept a lot of that viewership if the writers had a strong idea of what they wanted the 12th Doctor to be right off the bat. This is immediately evident in his wardrobe. Episode to episode, his style will switch between velvet jackets and button-down shirts akin to the 3rd Doctor to a more casual look consisting of hoodies and sweatshirts. Personally, I prefer the latter. But this indecisiveness extends to how the 12th Doctor is characterized, too. He practically had a new personality for each of his 3 seasons on the show. They knew they wanted him to be a meaner and grouchier incarnation, but they struggled to really pin down how they wanted to go about it. In Season 8, he was a heavily autistic-coded sociopath who seemed to have lost his ability to relate to human emotion. In Season 9, he was an aging rock star going through a midlife crisis. I do like that they let Peter Capaldi start playing his electric guitar when they started leaning more into that characterization. It's always cool when actors get to add their own personal touches to their doctors like that. In Season 10, he was a slightly grumpy but still very loving space grandpa, which was my favorite characterization. Also, the longer the show continued, the more they crammed his dialogue with distracting, trendy phrases and references.
Didn't I send you out to get me a lot? Oh, I'm sorry, I just thought it was tweeted.
Laters.
Laters.
And those were all just from one episode. Sure, aspects of all 3 of these versions of 12 are present across all of his 3 seasons, but it just comes across less like a consistent character arc and more like the writers not really knowing what to do with the actor they had. And that's a shame, because Peter Capaldi is an incredibly talented actor. Even if they didn't know what they wanted to do with the Doctor behind the scenes, Capaldi himself obviously had a passion for the show and a clear idea of how he wanted to play the character. He's a bit like Tom Baker in the sense that his performance was so good that it was enough to absolutely carry even the weakest scripts. And once the writers and actor finally clicked around the end of Season 9, that was absolute magic, and Capaldi was able to deliver some of his strongest performances for the rest of his tenure. Speaking of his tenure, let's talk companions. Clara carries over from the end of the 11th Doctor era, and in my last video I mentioned how she had a similar problem to 12, where she was introduced before the writers had a clear idea of what they wanted to do with her. But as soon as she was paired up with Peter Capaldi instead of Matt Smith, suddenly everything came together for her. In a strange way, the 12th Doctor's lack of a defined character in the beginning sort of helped shape Clara. Since this new version of the Doctor started off as cold and detached, Clara sort of started leaning more into the kinder and more compassionate side of his personality he had lost in the regeneration. And as she did that, she became more like the Doctor, which meant picking up a lot of his less than admirable traits, much to her horror. It's a very weird juxtaposition. On one hand, I do feel like Capaldi's characterization was something the writers struggled with simply due to how wildly it shifts season to season. But on the other hand, how they tie that characterization into Clara's arc makes it feel like that's how they planned it from the start. It really is that good. They changed her from being a nanny to being a teacher at Coal Hill School, because since the TARDIS can travel anywhere in space and time, obviously that means the Doctor is going to keep ending up at the exact same school over and over again. Along with this new job, they also gave her a new love interest in Danny Pink, a fellow teacher and a former soldier. That's another thing that makes me feel like they struggled to figure out what kind of character the 12th Doctor was. They made him have conflict with Danny by giving him this weird, forced, and completely out of nowhere hatred for soldiers. Like, sure, the Doctor's always had an anti-authoritarian attitude, but his beef has always been with the people at the top. I don't know, it's just a bizarre detail that they keep focusing on for his first season and then they never mention it again after that. Anyway, Danny's relationship with the Doctor might not be great, but I really enjoy his relationship with Clara. They have a very cute chemistry with each other, and even though he and the Doctor have a conflict with each other, I'm glad it's not just another, oh no, he's jealous of the Doctor and is constantly feeling inadequate compared to him, since we've already seen way too much of that already between Mickey and Rory. Danny felt like he had much more self-respect in that regard. He and Clara knew how they felt about each other, so he felt secure in their relationship. The conflict didn't come from jealousy, it came from Clara's insistence that she could balance her domestic life with Danny with her adventurous life with the Doctor. I think that only helps strengthen Clara's belief, whether she realizes it or not, that she can be a better version of the Doctor, saving lives and making hard decisions without abandoning her humanity. And when Danny dies due to something completely ordinary and out of the blue and Clara is unable to save him, she decides she can't handle this life anymore and gives up traveling with the Doctor. Until Jenna Coleman decided she didn't want to leave the show and came back for season 9, so she kind of had to learn that lesson a second time, but honestly I think they made it work. The first time she learned the lesson that she can't do everything, she lost someone close to her through no fault of her own. The second time it happened, it was because she actively put herself in danger without knowing what she was doing and paid the price for it. It's one of those instances where the conclusion being so inevitable makes it all the more effective. Until Hellbent undoes all the consequences, but we don't talk about Hellbent. After Clara, we got 2 new companions for Capaldi's final season. First was Nardole, who I honestly think is one of the most underrated Doctor Who companions ever. He started out as simply silly comic relief, but after he was upgraded to series regular, he became this sort of wise, sagely figure who was able to go toe-to-toe with the Doctor and took none of his nonsense, while also still being a silly, funny comic relief character.
What are you doing? It's me, Nardi!
He didn't show up all that often, but every time an episode started and I saw Nardole in the TARDIS, I knew it was going to be a fun one. And then there was Bill, who was probably one of the most refreshing additions the Capaldi era could have gotten. As much as I liked the character arc they did for Clara, I think giving her such a grand-scale story ultimately harmed 12's characterization in ways that weren't really noticeable until Bill came along. Pairing him up with a wide-eyed, normal person who's full to bursting with curiosity and questions about this new world she's found herself flung into serves to better anchor this version of the Doctor and ground him a bit more so we can see a new side of him. I feel like over the course of Stephen Moffat's time as showrunner, there have been too many companions that come from the Doctor needing to right some wrong or solve some grand mystery associated with them, so it was really refreshing to see him take on this companion simply because he liked her and thought she would be a good person to travel with. Bill just felt so real and down to earth after everything that happened with Clara. I like that bravery and the urge to be a hero don't exactly come naturally to her. There's something she needs to learn and develop over her time with the Doctor. She and Nardole also just make a really great duo. Pearl Mackie and Matt Lucas have great chemistry with each other.
Matt is my friend.
This is probably the least I've ever tried for a costume for this series. It's just my jacket. It's just my jacket and like a black t-shirt. What do you want from me? As I mentioned before, the 11th Doctor's run was marked by the increasingly convoluted and hard-to-follow arcs of each passing season. For the 12th Doctor's run, even though the seasonal arcs were still present, there seemed to be a conscious effort to tone them down heavily. They felt more akin to the days of Russell T Davies as the showrunner, where hints to the story were sprinkled throughout the season leading up to the big finale rather than having several episodes dedicated to progressing the arc. While this was certainly appreciated since the whirlwind of universal-scale time travel stories had become exhausting, a lot of these seasonal arcs really felt forced and phoned in. Like, Season 9 revolves around the mystery of a person or creature known as the Hybrid, but this really only results in the word hybrid being dropped awkwardly into conversation throughout the season and concludes with, we don't really know who or what the hybrid is, and it doesn't really matter anyway. Like, great, glad we did that. There's also Season 10, which revolves around the Doctor taking up a job as a college professor after being tasked with staying on Earth for 1,000 years to guard a mysterious vault. I think this could have been something really cool and unique, just work with the limitation that's been set for you and make a bunch of Earth-based adventures. But they kind of just act like the oath the Doctor has taken to guard the vault is more of a suggestion than a hard rule he has to follow. He's still taking off through time and space constantly, and the only consequence is that he makes Nardole mildly annoyed. It just sort of makes me wonder why they bothered with these arcs at all. It feels like Moffat had painted himself into a corner with his mystery box approach to storytelling and decided he couldn't write a season of Doctor Who without some big mystery hanging over it. But where the actual plots fell short, I believe the Capaldi era made up for it in terms of character. I already mentioned how much I like Clara and Bill's stories, and even though I felt like the Doctor's character could be a bit confused a lot of the time, the arcs they had him go on season to season were consistently compelling. Each season had him struggling with a new internal question, going from am I a good man, to is what I do ultimately positive for the universe, to do I even want to continue living anymore. So a consistent theme for his character, even though his personality took a while to iron out. With this idea, they also began playing with the concept of the Doctor making amends with his longtime villains. They teased us with this concept in one of my absolute least favorite Doctor Who stories ever made, The Magician's Apprentice and the Witch's Familiar, where the Doctor is summoned to Skaro in order to visit Davros on his deathbed. Part of why I hate this episode so much is that it has so many excellent interactions between these two ancient enemies. Davros seems genuinely remorseful for the life he's led and just wants the Doctor to forgive him, and it takes him a long time to accept that Davros is telling the truth. And when he finally does, their interactions are just so real and well performed that I think this would have been an excellent end for Davros. But no, in the end they reveal that this was all a trap and Davros was just tricking the Doctor all along. But no, double twist, the Doctor knew he was being tricked the whole time and was just tricking Davros. Great, glad we wasted that potential character development to end up right back at square one. Where they stumbled with Davros, though, they succeeded with the Master, now going by the name Missy, played by Michelle Gomez. I usually don't worry about spoilers in these videos, but I also want to appeal to both hardcore and casual Doctor Who fans, and since I know a lot of general audiences haven't seen the latter half of the Capaldi era, I'll keep this vague. I'll just say that even though I feel like they skipped a lot of the steps necessary to get to the conclusion they came to, I'm glad they committed a lot more than they did with Davros. I also want to touch on how they played around with the format of the show a bit during the Capaldi era. Nothing revolutionary or anything, but it was interesting to see them experiment. For season 9, they did almost all their stories in a 2-part episode format. This could have easily just resulted in overly padded stories trying desperately to justify their run times, but they, mostly, avoided this and actually did some really cool and clever things with the format. A personal favorite of mine is The Girl Who Died and the Woman Who Lived. In the first part, the Doctor saves a Viking girl named Ashieldr from dying by implanting her with alien technology, which also ends up making her immortal. In the second part, the Doctor catches up with her several centuries later, and we can see how that time has affected her. Both episodes have different settings, tones, and are written by completely different writers, which I just think is neat. I'm not absolutely in love with any of these stories, spoiler alert, none of them even cracked my top 5, but I appreciate them for what they are. Now we wrap up this video, as always, with my top 5 episodes, and to be honest, this was a really tricky one to put together. I knew which 5 episodes I wanted to be on the list, but I couldn't decide what order I wanted to put them in. Honestly, after this video goes up, I might have a completely different order I might want to put them in. We'll see, but for now, this is my top 5 Peter Capaldi episodes. Number 5. World Enough in Time and the Doctor Falls. The Doctor takes Missy to a distress call in deep space to see if she truly has given up her villainous ways. When they arrive, though, things quickly go wrong as they realize this place may be more dangerous than they initially thought. Again, I'm nervous to give too much away about this episode since it's the finale of Capaldi's final season, and I know how many people haven't watched this far. Although I guess even the BBC didn't care about spoilers for this one. Seriously, if you haven't seen any of this era of the show yet, do not watch the Next Time promos at the end of each episode. They give away every single cool twist in this story. Some of the most bafflingly awful marketing I've ever seen. I'm still mad about it all these years later. Anyway, what I will say is that this is an incredibly atmospheric story with some really great scenes of horror, incredibly effective emotional beats, and it really knows when to be quiet and let the actors act. Also, again, without spoilers, I feel like it really nails the conclusion to everybody's character arcs, Missy's especially. Also, some very clever sci-fi ideas. It's nice to see Moffat tell a more restrained story like this again. Number 4. Face the Raven. Clara is contacted by Rigsy, a young man she and the Doctor met in a previous episode, in order to solve the mystery of why he suddenly has a tattoo on the back of his neck that appears to be counting down. They soon discover that this tattoo means he has been marked for death by a shielder after he apparently killed someone living at her alien refugee camp, although he has no memory of it. In my opinion, this is the episode where the 12th Doctor finally came into his own. You can just see Capaldi getting more comfortable playing the character, and this is an absolute highlight of his performance for me. This episode also, sort of, serves as the conclusion to Clara's story, and I already talked about how I liked how they led up to this inevitable ending. I think bringing back Rigsy for this episode is a stroke of genius. In his original appearance, he served as sort of a companion to Clara's doctor, so having him return in a story focused on the consequences of Clara becoming the Doctor just makes perfect sense. Number 3. Mummy on the Orient Express. The Doctor takes Clara for a trip on an outer space replica of the Orient Express in the far future, where they soon discover that a monster known as the Foretold is also on board. Once it chooses a target, only they are able to see it, and they will be dead in exactly 66 seconds. This episode has quite possibly the most creative setup of this entire era, and I absolutely love everything they do with it. Adding the countdown timer at the bottom of the screen every time the Foretold appears is brilliant and gives the moment so much more tension. The episode also has a great tone, being simultaneously otherworldly and whimsical while also being ridiculously morbid and dark. It's a difficult line to walk, but fits so perfectly with the vibe and themes of the 12th Doctor. Plus it expands on Clara's story as she continues to grapple with her feelings on this new borderline sociopathic incarnation of her friend while also being horrified as she begins to adopt some of his less than desirable traits. This episode really is just firing on all cylinders. Number 2. Flatline. The exterior of the TARDIS suddenly begins shrinking, leaving the Doctor trapped inside and Clara all by herself to investigate a series of murders in which the victims are left as horrifying murals on the wall. I sort of touched on this episode earlier when talking about Face the Raven, but this is the episode that introduced Rigsy and really expanded on the idea of Clara slowly turning into the Doctor. Since he spends pretty much the entire episode trapped inside the TARDIS, she has to take charge of the situation. I like the ways that she chooses to handle things compared to how the Doctor might. It takes a creative setup, ties it in with themes of the season, and uses the potential it has beautifully. Speaking of beautiful, the way the monsters are portrayed is just jaw-dropping. I absolutely love how abstract they are, and the way they kill their victims is equal parts grisly and gorgeous. Number 1. Heaven Sent. The Doctor is teleported to a mysterious castle in the middle of the ocean. All alone, he must figure out who sent him there and why, all while a terrifying cloaked figure stalks him wherever he goes. Yeah, look at me, Class Act Jack picking the obvious choice for number 1 in his top 5 list, I know, but people like this episode for a reason. It's good. The Doctor is really the only character in this episode, and thus is basically an excuse for Peter Capaldi to flex what an incredible actor he is, as he spends 50 minutes by himself investigating this castle and trying to cope with the events of the previous episode, Face the Raven. It's just such a genius way for him to cope with that grief, giving the Doctor an extended period of time isolated in one place that never changes, giving him nobody to talk to but himself. This episode also has a great atmosphere to it. The monster stalking him is incredibly creepy, and putting screens everywhere that show what it's seeing at all times is such a genius and out-of-the-box idea that only serves to make it scarier. Plus, this episode features one of the greatest twists Moffat ever wrote during his time on Doctor Who. That's the problem with my favorite Capaldi episode being everybody's favorite Capaldi episode. I'm struggling to think of something to say about it that hasn't already been said. It's scary, it's tragic, it's triumphant, and it's regarded as the best for a reason. The 12th Doctor era is marked with some incredibly high highs and low lows, but I think the good vastly outweighs the bad. If you're a casual fan who gave up watching after Capaldi took over, I urge you to go back and watch his run. You won't regret it. Next time we're not going to have just a new Doctor, but a new showrunner. Oh boy. See you next time, guys, and laugh hard, run fast, be kind. Doctor, I let you go.